Stephen F. Hayward is the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a Fellow at the Claremont Institute, and a Senior Fellow at the Pacific Research Institute. He received his Ph.D. in American Studies from the Claremont Graduate School. He is the author of scores of articles on public policy and numerous books on statesmanship, including a 2-volume political biography of Ronald Reagan. Each year for over 15 years, he has co-authored the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators. Today, he will be speaking on the topic, the EPA and Private Property. Please join me in welcoming Stephen F. Hayward.
Well, thanks very much, and it's wonderful to be here at the Kirby Center. It's my first visit, and I want to especially thank David Bob for his really polite and generous depiction of my attention deficit disorder. How else do you explain, Reagan and the EPA? Well, there's a couple of explanations. One is that I sometimes say that I do environmental work because somebody has to take out the trash, right? But I only do it no more than about half of my time, because I like to say if I actually spent full time working on environmental issues, I would surely die from self-inflicted wounds before old age. There's so much craziness in the field, right? But more directly, I can find a connection for you. Being a native Californian, I remember that wonderful moment in the 1980 campaign when Ronald Reagan made a comment about trees cause pollution, much to the horror and shock of, everybody, right? Especially the news media. He was actually visiting the Claremont colleges where I was about to start graduate school at the time on a smoggy day in the fall. And the students would put up signs on trees saying, "Stop me before I kill again," and sort of mocking the president. Now, it turns out that then Governor Reagan, candidate Reagan, was completely right about that subject. He had a little out of proportion, but he was essentially correct about the role of naturally occurrent pollutants, especially nitrogen oxides that contribute to the ozone problem. And you can find, if you look around far enough on the EPA website, their own research into what they call biogenic emissions. They're embarrassed about this. They don't like to admit it, but it's there. And so the Gipper was right once again, and that's all the connection I need to draw between work on Ronald Reagan and the EPA. So I was asked to talk about a slightly different avenue of approach, but one that I think is getting more important, which, as was advertised, the EPA and property rights, or private property. Coterminous terms, of course. So I want to begin to frame this discussion with 4 propositions, and then we'll work through them in series and see if we can't try a few reforms at the end. One of the reasons we're in such trouble is that reforms are not simple and not perfect. So I'll come to that broad framing in a moment. The first proposition I want to make is that the primary threat to private property over the last century or more has come mostly from the actions of state and local government, more so than the federal government. And it's usually in the form of excessive zoning regulations and abuses of the eminent domain power. And these abuses were enabled and abetted by the judiciary's abdication as a protector of property rights over the course of a century. And this has opened the way to mischief from the federal level. Now, there have been some partial victories in the courts on this front in recent years, but there's still a very long way to go. And this will turn out to be one of the central problems that we face as we go forward. The second proposition is about the nature of the EPA. The EPA at its founding, and certainly for its first couple of decades for the most part, and to a large extent still today, should be thought of really as just a supercharged public health agency. They wouldn't necessarily describe their mission that way. They think their mission is to save the earth, but really they're a public health agency. Its main mission at its origin was to protect environmental threats to public health, and chiefly in 1970, that meant giant smokestacks, automobile tailpipes, large sources of effluents into our major rivers and water bodies. And that meant in large part, by the way, getting local governments to upgrade their sewage treatment programs. So the problem was as much government as it was private industry, or the chemical factory of the New Yorker cartoons dumping stuff into a river or lake. Some of that went on, but a large part of it was local government problems. With only a few exceptions, the EPA in those years was not much concerned with or much of a threat to private property, with the exception, very early on, of Superfund sites. or things like Superfund sites that involved toxic pollution or toxic waste and things of that kind. The Endangered Species Act, which David referred to, is the province primarily of the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Department of the Interior. So the main trouble there doesn't come from EPA, although sometimes EPA gets implicated in Endangered Species Act cases through the typical interagency permit process hell. This leads to my third proposition, which is that the threat to property rights has started to invert from state and local government up to the federal government. In general, from the federal government, as David made reference to kangaroo rats in California, but lately the problem has been the federal government saying to farmers in the Central Valley, forget about your rats, you don't get any water that you historically had rights to for a century. Maybe even a property right, one might say, even though that's a murky and complicated problem. And the EPA is expanding its reach further into private property questions, and the chief vehicle to do this is the Clean Water Act, about which more in a moment. My fourth proposition is that this entire problem cannot or should not be viewed in isolation from the broader problem of the breakdown of the separation of powers. That's a century-long story. The delegation of authority by Congress to the bureaucracy, and the perversion of administrative law today. This is what scholars at Hillsdale, our friends at the Heritage Foundation across the street, and others refer to as the problem of the administrative state. So hence, our remedies or reforms in the service of protecting property rights will need to be conceived, I think, within a broader framework of restoring the proper constitutional balance between the branches across the board, as well as constitutional restraints on certain kinds of government activity. So let's work through these propositions in turn. The erosion of property rights protection in general is a long story, entangled story, and I don't propose to recall even in summary form the entire constitutional history today. That would take too long and you'd all fall asleep, I think. But there are a few modern scenes worth noting that can sharpen our focus on a couple of essential matters. I'd like to point to two modern Supreme Court cases. One is New Orleans v. Dukes from 1976. And the second is Midkiff versus Hawaii Housing Authority in 1984. Some people know a bit about the Midkiff case. It's purely a property rights case. The first one, New Orleans v. Dukes, is not on the surface a property rights case, but shows a problem in a broader scale. The Dukes case involved a woman named Nancy Dukes who sold hot dogs from a pushcart in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And she'd been doing it for about 2 years when the New Orleans City Council passed an ordinance that said, she had a license for the pushcart. It revoked all licenses for pushcarts from anyone who had not been selling hot dogs from pushcarts for at least 8 years. Okay, it sounds like a neutral condition, except that ordinance had the effect of only putting a single person out of business, Nancy Dukes. This was clearly an ordinance that was promulgated to some favored people. Maybe there were payoffs involved, who knows? You hear that kind of thing happens in New Orleans once in a while, right? And so Nancy Dukes sued, and the case made its way to the Supreme Court. She claimed the violation of equal protection of the laws and due process claims, which really the courts haven't smiled upon for a very long time. And the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of the city of New Orleans. So Nancy Dukes lost her case. And in ruling for the city, the Supreme Court said, among other things, quote, when local economic regulation is challenged solely as violating the Equal Protection Clause, this court consistently defers to legislative determination as to the desirability of a particular statutory determination. The court added that we will not sit as a super legislature to judge the wisdom or desirability of legislative policy determinations made in areas that neither affect fundamental rights nor proceed along suspect lines. Close quote. Now, by the end, by the way, that bit about suspect lines, what does they mean? Well, that's civil rights cases. Those of you students and others who have done your constitutional history will know that ever since the dubious Caroline Products case of 1938, the Supreme Court has said there are two classes of rights. There are economic rights, which includes property rights, and then there are your civil and political rights. And we have two standards. We have what they call either legislative deference, or essentially the legislature can do whatever it wants, and Congress. And then there's strict scrutiny. If someone's going to restrict your freedom of speech or freedom of religion, we're going to make sure they have a really good reason for it. So to put it in plain English, the court has reached this two-tiered standard where for economic regulation and economic rights, Court says, we're not going to bother you very much, whereas for political rights, we'll bother you a lot. You don't need any reason at all, really, or you need a whole lot of good reasons. I don't think you need to be very inventive to suggest that there is no way that you can divine any intelligible principle from the text of the Constitution for that distinction. That is one the court has made up. Now, I could have picked other cases. There's a lot of them like this, going back over the years, back into the 1940s. Williamson Optical out of Oklahoma in 1952 is another egregious case of this kind. But the reason this one is fun, I think, is, and a good way of illustrating this is, and why I like a case out of the French Quarter, is suppose as a thought experiment that Nancy Dukes had been a nude dancer in the French Quarter. I hear they have some of those there. Or to modify it, and so instead of a hot dog vendor, she'd been a nude dancer at some place of entertainment. And suppose the city of New Orleans had passed an ordinance that targeted her to prevent her from plying her trade around the polls. She would have won her case on the grounds that her free expression under the First Amendment was being violated, right? Irving Kristol famously remarked of the jurisprudence of free expression that, quote, it's okay for a 16-year-old to dance naked on stage as long as you pay her the minimum wage. Today, he'd add, obviously, and provide her health insurance and contraception. This, by the way, raises the possibility that Nancy Dukes was not inventive enough. She should have been a naked hot dog vendor. That would have crossed the streams of the Supreme Court justices, since Chief Justice John Paul Roberts, as I'm calling him now, wasn't yet on the scene to advise the court on the possibilities of the taxing clause. The point is that it is obviously incoherent to us to have a judicial doctrine that says that the right to make a living is not as fundamental as your right to speak. And certainly property is implicated in that too, right? The second case I mentioned is Midkiff versus Hawaii Housing Authority, the 1984 case. This involved a legislative scheme to use the power of eminent domain in Hawaii, essentially to confiscate the land. I mean, they're going to pay the compensation the way that the takes-in clause requires, but then to give the land to other people, not for public use. See, usually eminent domain was meant you're going to take the land for a road, a military base. A baseball stadium, even though if it's privately owned, is arguably public use because the public gets to go there. But in this case, they weren't going to take the land for some public use, the way that phrase is meant by common sense, but they wanted to redistribute the land because the problem in Hawaii was that 90% of the land was owned by one company, dating back into the 19th century and the way the island was settled, right? In that case, the court decided unanimously, again, in favor of the state of Hawaii to use the power of eminent domain, not for taking land for public use, but for, as the court put it, a public purpose, right? And the unanimous decision, the unanimous opinion was written by Sandra Day O'Connor, and recognized that the court at that time didn't yet have Justice Scalia, but it had William Rehnquist, and he was part of this 9-0 majority. Now, between then and now, there have been some significant property rights victories at the Supreme Court. There was the Nolan case in 1987, where Justice Scalia, then newly on the court, said that the California Coastal Commission could not practice extortion in the issuance of building permits to individual landowners. And then in 1992, there was the Lucas case out of South Carolina, which said that the state of South Carolina couldn't render someone's land valueless through regulation. That was a pretty extreme case and a pretty easy one. And those were good, but they didn't really go far enough. They were sort of narrow cases, as so often is the case. Now fast forward to the 2005 case that many of you are probably familiar with of Kelo versus the City of New London out of Connecticut. Once again, this was a public purpose case. If you remember the facts of the case, Suzanne Kelo had a nice house down near the water. It wasn't a blighted neighborhood. And the city wanted to condemn her house and the others in the neighborhood to give the land not for a stadium, not for a firehouse or a police station or a road or even a municipal parking lot, but to give it to a large corporation which wanted to expand its headquarters. And the public purpose justification was, well, it will expand our tax base. We'll get more tax money out of it that way. And the surprise of this case to many legal observers was first that the court took the case at all. They thought, based on precedents like the Midkiff case and others, I can't imagine they'll be lucky to get more than Clarence Thomas's vote on a case like this, right? Instead, They got 4 votes. This really did surprise people that it came that close. The defector was the usual one, Justice Kennedy. And moreover, the very strong dissent in the case, saying that Ms. Kelo should have won the case, was written by Sandra Day O'Connor, then about to leave the court. So you can see that, sometimes these people get a little better. It's not always a one-way street the wrong way. And then there's the more recent case that some of you may have heard of, the Sackett case, which represents a small step in the right direction, although very small. This is a case from just the last few months. And I want to come back to that case in a little bit. So hold the Sackett thought for a moment. The second proposition I was making, so to summarize, the first point is that the constitutional protection of property rights by the judiciary is exceedingly weak. There's a couple of tiny bright spots, but that's been a sad 100-year-long story about which we should still be complaining very loudly. The second proposition was about the EPA. As I said, that it was originally a public health agency in 1970 aimed at genuine, significant pollution problems. I grew up in LA when I couldn't breathe in the summertime. And setting aside for the moment the cost of EPA regulation, I'll pause here to say that I like to say that the EPA's specialty is devising billion-dollar solutions to million-dollar problems. Although a lot of people tell me, oh, you've got that way off. It's more like $10 billion solutions to million-dollar problems. That's probably right. They're the best at it in government. They're the farthest out of whack of anybody. We'll say more about that in a moment. But setting aside the cost of EPA regulations and the often perverse process by which they do it, about which I can bore you silly for a long time, we've gotten impressive results from our environmental objectives, right? We have enormous reductions in air pollution. I like to say that it may come as soon as for my children are going to say, but certainly my grandchildren will say, smog, what was that? Even true of LA, by the way. So when I was growing up in LA, this town used to violate, the city, the basin used to violate the 1-hour ozone standard almost 200 days a year. For the last 10 years, it's seldom violated the old 1-hour ozone standard more than 10 days a year. And actually, that's not even the whole basin. That's just a couple of isolated places. For the majority of the population of the Los Angeles basin, their exposure to days above the 1-hour ozone standard for the last 10 years has been 0 or close to 0 in 10 years. That's something to celebrate, even while we reserve our right to be critical of all the wrong-headed ways the EPA has gone about this, and especially the local regulators in California who actually, the EPA, in an odd way, is irrelevant to California in some ways, but that's a separate story. Other things can be pointed out in water pollution. I will add, for those who are curious, I can talk about this subject for a long time, but the real hero of the study is not so much the story, it's not so much the EPA or even the landmark legislation, but it really is technology. One of the things about the modern environmental movement is they really do seem to have the mentality of the second Star Trek series, where the captain would say, make it so, and it would happen magically because it's science fiction. And the environmental mentality is, if we mandate it, it will just happen. Well, the story that's never told is all the technology and regulatory mandates that had to be abandoned because they weren't possible. The ones that worked are the ones where engineers in the private sector figured out ways to devise much more efficient ways of combusting fuel, efficient, cost-effective ways of capturing pollution, and so forth. The real heroes of environmental progress are engineers, not environmental lawyers. I'm always amused that whenever you hear that somebody is a senior scientist at the Natural Resources Defense Council, then you look at their degree, it's usually a JD from Harvard. Okay. I think lawsuits are the way we improve the environment. No, it's engineers. And why students are sometimes disappointed when I say, if you're seriously interested in the environment, study science and become an engineer. Well, that's not what they want to hear. They want to become crusaders to save the planet. They want to be Rachel Carson, right? Okay. Now, I think a case could be made that based on this progress, that the original EPA is obsolete, and that the EPA today should be shrunk or maybe even shut down, as we did with the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Civil Aeronautics Board that outlived their usefulness, or that most of its tasks should be devolved to the states and local government, even though they already are in a certain way. Instead, according to the well-known internal logic of bureaucratic behavior, the EPA is looking for ever smaller monsters to destroy, and are seeking out ever smaller increments of reduced health risk, and in reality, no reduced health risk at all from recent proposed measures, at ever increasing cost and intrusiveness. The classic case right now is what's known as the boiler MACT rules, as they're called in the trade. MACT is maximum achievable control technology in the jargon, if you're not familiar with it. And you know what these rules essentially say is, well, we've got to squeeze mercury out of everything, even though mercury emissions are so tiny as to be almost undetectable. And moreover, because there is no evidence in the government's own health statistics that there are any health risks from mercury to anyone. And the EPA in their fine print even acknowledges this. But that doesn't slow them down a bit. This is one of those little wrinkles. They claim huge benefits from the boiler MACT rules in reducing mercury and a couple other pollutants. But none of the benefits are from reducing mercury. All the benefits are from reducing other kinds of conventional pollution, which we already have regulatory programs for. So why are they going ahead with this? They're going ahead with it for the usual reasons that bureaucracies become single-minded by their nature, believing that what they're doing is the most important thing to happen in the world, and they're resistant to trade-offs or even considerations of trade-offs of any kind. But more specifically, the Clean Water Act has become the main wedge by which the EPA is now threatening private property. So the Clean Water Act, as it was written back in the 70s, talks about, and the key phrase is, reducing pollution to the navigable waters of the United States. Well, now, silly us, you probably think navigable waters means things like, rivers that you can put a boat in, or lakes, the Great Lakes. Along the way, environmentalists and the EPA said, well, but to prevent pollution, and this argument is not completely insensible, but I'm not sure it's what Congress understood was going to happen when they passed the Clean Water Act. Their argument was, if you're going to prevent pollution to the Mississippi River, or the Ohio River, or smaller rivers, you've got to worry about their little tributaries, the little creeks. And you need to worry about wetlands, where water runs off from rain periodically into the... So in other words, you couldn't reduce pollution to our navigable waters unless we also extend our regulatory reach to what we might call, for shorthand, unnavigable waters, which means all of them as a practical matter. And the courts looked at this and they said, we see nothing here that bothers us. And so the EPA for a very long time, as you know, has been in the business of regulating wetlands, plus other agencies. Army Corps of Engineers has got a large role in this for odd reasons. Now, one question is, this argument about a little creek or a tributary into a larger river that goes into the Mississippi, that makes some sense. That's not a ridiculous idea. But what about a wetland? What is a wetland? It's not sufficient to do it the way the Supreme Court did with pornography. I know it when I see it. No, we've got a little phone book-sized thing to define what a wetland is. And even with an attempt to do sort of rigidly detailed legal specifications, you still have the case that there's a lot of play in the joints, a lot of room for arbitrary determinations by EPA and local government and other agencies. And you'd be surprised some of the things that end up being called wetlands and subject to regulation. Now, the EPA has lost some ground in this area, not entirely unlike the Obamacare case and the Commerce Clause for the individual mandate. The EPA lost a case a few years ago involving, what was it, the Swank case it was called. This was, sort of ponds that were seasonal that never ran off into anything, right, out of Illinois, or they were just combined in a single state, by the way, because the justification of the Clean Water Act is interstate commerce. So in a couple of places they've been limited, but not much. And some of the arguments in favor of this expansive regulation were pretty ridiculous. Yeah, one of them was called the glancing geese test. Well, if a migratory bird flying over state boundaries might actually land in that puddle, that makes it subject to interstate commerce, interstate regulation. So that became, if the glancing geese test, well, if the bird even looks at it, in a fond way, well, that, we get jurisdiction, right? Well, that brings us to the Sackett case and to a small bit of good news. The Sacketts were a family that bought a nice lot near Priest Lake in northern Idaho, zoned residential, surrounded by other houses already, and they began preparations to build on the lot, including grading and filling, which you would do to get ready to build a house. And that's when the EPA arrived out of the blue, issuing what it called an administrative compliance order, which not only said, halt what you're doing, but take out all the fill and restore the wetland to its previous condition. The Sackett said, may we challenge this determination that it's a wetland? Answer from EPA, no, you may not. And by the way, if you don't comply, you face fines of up to $75,000 per day. question here, that fine level is in the statute, but do we think that $75,000 a day fine meant to apply to small individual lot owners, or do you think it meant DuPont? I mean, to ask the question is pretty much to answer it, right? I don't think Congress would ever have approved a Clean Water Act if it thought that a bureaucracy would be threatening a small individual landowner with that kind of fine. The Sacketts were further told that they couldn't even challenge the administrative compliance order unless they ignored it and started racking up the fines. Well, that's you've got the gun to your head, right? Say, do you want to challenge our right to use it, right? Hypothetically, they could have been liable for millions of dollars in fines if they went that route and lost. That doesn't really sound much like due process to me. Well, the case made it to the Supreme Court. The Sacketts quite bravely challenged it with the help of the Pacific Legal Foundation. And the Supreme Court ruled 9-0, the current Supreme Court, 9-0 against the EPA in this case. So not even the liberals were willing to back up the Supreme Court, back up the EPA's direction in this case. And one of the problems that Justice Alito, who wrote the majority opinion, points out is there's so much uncertainty and arbitrariness in what is a wetland, what isn't, when is the EPA going to step in, when are they not. And so he wrote in the opinion the following: the combination of the uncertain reach of the Clean Water Act and the draconian penalties imposed for the sort of violations alleged in this case still leaves most property owners with little practical alternative but to dance to the EPA's tune. Alito went on to say something the court doesn't do all that often, does it some, but what he said was Congress needs to sort this out. Congress needs to provide reasonably clear jurisdictional rules to define what waters really are that make it subject to regulatory control. Here's his actual language. For 40 years, Congress has done nothing to resolve this critical ambiguity, and the EPA has not seen fit to promulgate a rule providing a clear and sufficiently limited definition of the phrase. Instead, the agency has relied on informal guidance. But far from providing clarity and predictability, the agency's latest informal guidance advises property owners that many jurisdictional determinations concerning wetlands can only be made on a case-by-case basis by EPA field staff. Close quote. That's the very definition of arbitrary government. I mean, the whole point of bureaucracy in the abstract is that there will be uniformity and predictability in the administration of government. And what you have here is no predictability and no uniformity in the administration of government. That, if not arbitrary, is maybe even can be characterized as lawless government. By the way, the EPA is now working on a new guidance document that would simply remove the word navigable from its understanding of the Clean Water Act. So let's not even bother with that. We'll regulate anything we want to. That's essentially what that would mean. Well, what are the remedies for this state of affairs? There are no simple ones, though there are a few innovations like the RAINS Act that ought to be tried out. Now, the RAINS Act, that's an acronym, right? It stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. That and its twin, the Regulatory Accountability Act that passed the House in late 2011. It won't pass the Senate, at least not this Senate. So the RAINS Act would require that any major new rules be approved by a joint resolution of Congress and then sent to the President for signature. In other words, it would introduce some political accountability into the rulemaking process. In other words, if the EPA issued a costly new rule like the Boiler MAC rule, it would be in effect a legislative proposal. And the RAINS Act would provide for expedited procedures to bring it to an up or down vote so it doesn't get lost in committee hearings and some of the usual midnight madness of those folks over there. Now, the RAINS Act represents an audacious reassertion of congressional lawmaking prerogatives, and that's precisely why liberals and environmentalists don't like it. But my argument is pretty simple. Why shouldn't we make members of Congress stand and be counted on the record on regulatory proposals that cost $100 million or more, even if that means it will take them away from important things like naming post offices or proclaiming National Orange Juice Week? Borrowing that language from a friend of mine, actually. The second idea requires some thought. I'm just beginning this thought, which is, starting back in the Reagan years, sensible economists, Hillsdale-type people across the street at Heritage, said one way to try and rein in bureaucracy in general, but especially the EPA, is to have cost-benefit analysis. Simple idea. If the costs of a regulation are greater than the benefits it delivers, we shouldn't do it. Even though, by the way, some environmental statutes say the EPA, like the Clean Air Act, should not take account of costs, just only benefits. In the real world, they do look at costs some. They're not complete idiots. However, the bureaucracy across the board, and especially the EPA, have gotten very good at gaming cost-benefit analysis. Cost, hardly any cost. Benefits, huge. And the Office of Management and Budget will look this over and often pass on these things, even though any serious analysis, and by the way, they're always the size of a phone book, so they're daunting for someone to get through and unravel to point out how silly they are or how ill-founded they are. But, they bury you in paperwork. That's what bureaucracies are good at. And it's very difficult and almost impossible to get a court, if you take these to court, to say that an agency hasn't done cost-benefit analysis properly. So cost-benefit analysis has been of limited use and limited effectiveness, and the always protean bureaucracy has figured out ways to adapt and go around it. So one question would be, would there be a way by statute and or by executive order of a president, pay attention, Mr. Romney, to have an enforceable cost-benefit standard that allowed for more substantive judicial review? Now, that sounds like something that you say, why aren't you asking judges to become expert economists? No, I don't think it is. Every once in a while, you will actually see a court take notice of one of these things. And so there was an interesting case last year at the Court of Appeals level that caught my eye. It was called Business Roundtable versus SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission. So what did these guys do? They'd issue a rule requiring that if you're a shareholder for a company and you get your annual report and your ballot for board members for an upcoming shareholders meeting, that the company must include materials about the independent nominees who may have been put forward for board membership. Now, what was behind all this? Well, this was a rule by the SEC to try to promote representation by unions and state pension funds, and I won't put too fine a point on it, other troublemakers, right? Shareholder activists. Well, why should a corporation have to pay to promote the interest of its enemies or its critics? But that's what the SEC was trying to get people to do. Now, the authorizing statutes of the SEC require them to consider the economic consequences of its rules. So there is a statutory provision that has some legal force. Part of the language talks about the efficiency, competition, and capital formation, the effects on those by these proposed rules. So that amounts to a cost-benefit standard. They didn't call it that in the statute, but it's there. So the court threw out this proposed rule of the SEC requiring that companies have to pay for promote the interest of its critics. And the court said this in its finding: the commission inconsistently and opportunistically framed the cost and benefits of the rule, failed adequately to quantify the certain costs or to explain why those costs could not be quantified, neglected to support its predictive judgments, contradicted itself, and failed to respond to substantial problems raised by commenters. Now, it seems to me if we can do that with the SEC, we ought to be able to do that with other agencies like the EPA. And that will lead me to one last reform that I have heard no person suggest so far. And it's this. If you look back at older regulatory agencies like the SEC, the Federal Communications Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, these things that go back to the New Deal era, nearly all of them have one thing that marks them out as very different from the EPA. Two things, really. One is all those agencies are single industry agencies, right? The SEC regulates the financial world. The Labor Relations Board, labor unions and labor relations. The FCC, communications. The FDA, food and drugs. The EPA regulates who? Well, just about everybody. There's one other important difference that makes this reform, I think, important. All those other agencies I mentioned, they typically don't have one administrator at the top. They have a 5-member board appointed by the president, but with a sort of partisan balance. That is to say, they're appointed for fixed terms, right, 4 or 5 years. The president appoints all of them, but but 2 of the 5 members always have to be from the party out of power in the White House. So the president gets to tip the balance of power. The EPA has an administrator, and the original statute authorizing the EPA gives amazing discretion to that administrator to define all kinds of broad terms, which has led to a lot of the mischief we had. My reform is, why not make the EPA like the FCC or the NLRB? Instead of an administrator, why not have 5 environmental commissioners appointed by the president with minority party representation? In other words, what people might say is, well, that would be putting politics back into the EPA. And my answer is precisely. It's not a perfect solution. I mean, we're following the mischief of the NLRB under President Obama, but it would return the EPA into a political sphere and introduce political accountability and make for sharper partisan argument over what the agency is doing on the commissioner level. And as I said, that's not a perfect solution, but that would be a significant reform, and I think change the culture of the EPA dramatically if we did it that way. As I say, I haven't heard anyone make that proposal, but I think that's one. For one thing, I would just simply enjoy the screams of anguish from environmentalists when that proposal gets unveiled. They'll absolutely go berserk, and that always makes my day. You know, that's always fun. It's not hard to make them do that, but that one's really fun. So I think what I'm going to do, sort of one more point about this. As I say, that's not a perfect solution. It's fitting that we're talking about this seemingly narrow subject here at the Kirby Center, because what I said at the very beginning is we need to have a broad theme or broad approach to this problem that really goes beyond the EPA. So I'm teaching a 1-week course this week over at AEI for a summer student program they do. That's on a subject very dear to the heart of Hillsdale College and the Kirby Center. It's a course on statesmanship. I'm trying to do in a week what Hillsdale College does in, well, you know, a year in some courses, or 2 years for the graduate program you're starting, right? Where is David hiding? So hard subject to do. But the point is that it's pretty clear that at the end of the day, what is required for this and similar problems is a higher degree of constitutional literacy by members of Congress, by citizens, really by everybody. And that means, as a broad matter, what you need is more and intensive sustained argument about some old basic principles, such as why property rights are human rights, every bit as much as free speech and freedom of religion, why the separation of powers is an essential bulwark of individual liberty that we have allowed to slip away and needs to be reestablished. You know, we're all disappointed with the outcome of the Obamacare case, quite rightly, for a lot of reasons that are obvious. On the other hand, 2 years ago, no one thought there'd be more than 2 votes for certain for the position that the Commerce Clause actually had a real limit in it. And we ended up with 5 votes, sort of. As I say, Chief Justice John Paul Roberts, as I call him. I sure hope Stevens has sent him all his old bow ties. Right? But there were 5 votes for that position, and we'll see if it leads to something. It's not clear now whether that's a sort of a Pyrrhic victory on our side or not. But nonetheless, the lesson I draw from that is the commotion over the constitutionality of Obamacare, connected with all the Tea Party activity, was the most salutary development in sort of constitutional argument in at least a generation. So to that extent, no matter how the case came out, I always thought that we were winning something important, even if we didn't get the decision in the end. And we lived to fight another day in the election and in Congress and so forth. But let that not be the end of this broad argument about sort of constitutional literacy. And it's important not to get bogged down too far into some of the particulars of things like just the EPA, or I didn't talk about the Administrative Procedure Act. That really gets off in the weeds, but that probably ought to be rewritten for modern times. And it's a very technical argument, but it's one that's very important. But even before or along with doing that, you want to, as I say, emphasize this broader argument about what constitutionalism means for a free people. So I will stop there, and we can go on to questions and comments and discussion. So you guys are going to find people for me? Is that how it's going to work? Yep. Okay.
We now have time for a few questions. I would ask that you would please wait until the microphone has been brought to you to ask your question.
Okay. Oh, RJ's got one back there. And there's one up here.
I think one of the problems that I saw when I was in air and radiation in the late 80s was that a lot of the more radical Greens who were there on the staff and so on actually seemed to have this belief that it was possible to move into a world of zero emissions. They really did think that you could find make up some sort of green physics or something in which you would transform matter into energy without any byproducts or whatever. And I think that's still there. I think the BMAC thing sort of shows that. They just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and they still won't stop.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that the law, was that a comment or question, was that it? Or?
That was just a comment.
Yeah, no, I think I should have been stronger on that point in my comments. It's not just that the logic of bureaucracies is always to keep going and expanding. We know that from public choice theory and so forth. I was talking to students yesterday, I think, about the quaintness of the progressive view of 100 years ago that you will have disinterested, public-spirited experts in these bureaucracies making decisions full of wisdom for the public interest. Of course, that's not how it works out in real life. You get, as Hayek and others have explained, he didn't use the word fanaticism, but you combine utopianism, the sort of single-minded cultures of bureaucracy, you get, in effect, exactly right. Ultimately, the EPA will not stop until you get to zero. That's clearly the logic of the whole thing. Some people believe it out of wacko conviction. Other people believe it because that's just the nature of bureaucracies. You get very single-minded, and that's the way they go. Because you see that in other bureaucracies in their equivalents, right? Financial regulation, you can see how it works in some of those areas. It's right. So this is, I think we need to understand, more people need to understand that there's no such thing as a disinterested bureaucracy, right? Full stop. This gentleman had a question, I think, or, well, whatever. Either one, whoever you're closer to.
My name is Mike. I just found it particularly poignant that you used the term erosion to describe what's happening to our property rights. Yeah. But
well,
on the subject of erosion,
I could use termites, federal termites too, if you like.
It's apparently the now, I don't know if it's a Virginia EPA or a federal EPA is now requiring that you fence in all streams that cross grazing land. And I wondered if you would comment on that and how that relates to your thoughts on eminent domain.
Oh, well, did you all hear the question? It was about requiring fencing on grazing land that crosses streams. And yeah, well, so here's the problem. One way of thinking about the technical aspects of the problem of water pollution is we've pretty much built all the wastewater treatment plants that we can. I mean, there's a few out there that could be upgraded and whatnot. And, no chemical company dumps stuff just straight into a river much anymore without it being treated or so forth. But, we still have some water pollution problems of uncertain magnitude, by the way. Our monitoring of water quality is pretty abysmal. We're slowly getting better at it, but boy, we're 20 years behind where we ought to be. That said, so the problem now is this sort of runoff from fields, streets, all kinds of things. Now, the regulatory solution is what you propose except on everything. In other words, so we had this episode here a few weeks ago. Was the EPA using drones to spy on people? Well, no, they're actually using black helicopters. No, they're actually using planes with pilots, and they're taking aerial photographs. You can do satellite photographs too. So, clearly the logic is, well, we're going to regulate every farm field in the country. This can't possibly work because there aren't enough regulators to enforce that. Plus, because every piece of land is a little bit unique, a uniform regulation will get things wrong. 80%, I'm going to guess 80% of the time, maybe not. But the point is, an old tailpipe regulation on a car or an effluent standard for a wastewater treatment plant, that makes some sense. You can figure that out. But some kind of uniform regulatory standard, which is what bureaucracy does, that can't possibly work for regulating water runoff with all the different hydrological conditions in a big country like this, but that is what they want to do. So what you mentioned is, fencing off grazing land or, creating buffers against streams. In many individual cases, that may make good sense. In the fullness of time, it seems to me you're going to want to think about some technical solutions. And also, I think ultimately what you need to rely on is the incentives and or best practices and judgment of individual landowners to persuade them that it's in their interest and the interest of their neighbors to think about things they might do to reduce runoff into streams from their animals and so forth. So in other words, to restate it, the basic problem, as RJ and others have pointed out for years of the Endangered Species Act, is that it gets the incentives backwards, right? You wake up one morning, David talked about it, You see a kangaroo rat in your land, but the Fish and Wildlife Service hasn't been there yet. What do? You shoot, shovel, and shut up. Exactly. This is completely wrong, right? So let's do this let's do the whole thing with water, right? Let's tell everybody everywhere, we're going to be after you. And what do you think they're going to say? No. So, you have the entire farming sector and ranchers around the country in an uproar about what may be coming at, quite rightly so. And neither the environmental movement nor the EPA has the imagination to step back and say, maybe we got to think about a different way to go after this that doesn't make this adversarial and punitive, and they don't. Because, by the way, a lot of the environmental movement is life is no fun if it's not adversarial and punitive. That's not a joke, actually, right? And that's, there's some, the really extreme ones are hostile ideologically to private property anyway, just as a general matter. And so it's not simply a matter of they're just dumb, they're also malicious in a lot of ways too. So this is a big problem, and this fight's going to go on a while. And, if you're actually seriously interested in environmental protection, this is a disaster, because those problems are genuine and they deserve some attention and some significant remedy, but not at the cost of producing people's property rights, their rights to make a living, and not at the cost of having an army of new bureaucrats running around making a mess of things. Long speech, but that's my opinion. So, yeah.
I'll make 2 apologies in advance before asking this question. 1, I'm sorry if you feel that you've already answered it, and 2,
It's all right.
I'm sorry if if it demands an answer far too lengthy for what you can deliver here. But basically the question is, what do you think is the proper, broadly speaking, the proper conservative environmental approach? Because I know that you and people like Roger Scruton have been agonizing in recent years over, well, that may be too strong a word, but you've certainly been working to attempt to take back an issue that I feel the left has sort of almost monopolized because it's far easier for it to. So could you, if you could please, in the time that we have, sketch out what you think broadly would be the proper conservative environmental approach?
Yeah, I can do that, sort of a brief outline of it. That's not hard to do. Yeah, I like to say a couple of things. This is part serious but part mischievous. I like to say the environment is much too important to be left to the environmentalists. They just screw it up, right, by making it all bureaucratic. And by the way, that's even true from their own point of view. Just assume for a minute you're kind of I'll just say radical environmentalist. Well, right now, the politics and environment is such that there is no possibility of any legislation they would like getting through Congress. They're all depressed that cap and trade didn't pass. That was their own darn fault. And it's their darn fault that I like to make this point to environmental. I really bust their chops about this. I said, so the first President Bush, forget President George W. Bush. Okay, you didn't like him. The first President Bush makes the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act a major legislative priority, goes to Rio and commits us to the UN framework on climate change, a bad idea, but he still does it. He pushes hard on the wetland stuff. He does 2 or 3 other things. He appoints William Riley, head of the EPA, who was pretty far to the left. How many environmental groups endorsed him for re-election in 1992? 0. Point is, I accuse them of bad faith and partisan bad faith. So why do you guys want to be an adjunct to the Democratic Party? How's that working for you? I have fun with that, but there's a broader point to all that. But the second point is this is where Roger Scruton and I we have some disagreements. He's hung up on plastic bags, and he shouldn't be, but anyway. But he does get this right, if you've seen his book. Property rights ought to be the cornerstone of it. Do you know the lectures? Why does no one ever wash a rented car? Right? They don't own it, right? People who own stuff tend to take care of it. It's true of landowners, by the way, for the most part. There's always some negligent landowners, just as there's some people who don't wash the cars they own. Okay, fine. Property rights, genuine markets, but also understanding that, and this is Roger's point, and I agree with it, is that at the end of the day, we improve our environment as individuals. By the choices we make and by actually caring about it. And the great phrase Roger uses that I like is that the problem with conventional environmental thinking is it has confiscated these issues and transferred them to government. And it actually makes us irresponsible, right? When you by the way, this is true in a broader domain. When you confiscate risk from people, does it actually lower risk or increase it? You all may know the story about all the research starting in the 60s and then again with airbags in the 80s. The first generation of seatbelt wearers and the first generation of people with airbags. Suffered fewer injuries and crashes, absolutely. Caused more crashes. You follow what I'm saying here? You know why that happened? Because people intuitively thought, oh, my risk is lower because I now have seatbelts and airbags. So they actually caused net more harm until we all had airbags and seatbelts going, right? Something of that same dynamic happens in the environment. If you turn it over and say it's the government's job solely and primarily, it leads to kind of an environmental illiteracy. And so, again, the broad theme is environmental citizenship is not a crazy idea if we can keep the environmental movement from spoiling it. I can say more, but I'm going to stop there, and I have room for a couple more questions.
We actually have a question from our online audience. Michelle asks, can you please comment more on the effect that EPA regulations have on business? How serious is the threat of regulatory uncertainty?
Oh, jeepers, that's sort of a hard question to ask without sort of getting into specifics. Well, I'll just say it can be huge because you've got to get your permits. I'll just mention one case study that's interesting. So the Clean Air Act says, part of it reads this way, there's always more to it. The Clean Air Act says, if you emit 100 pounds a year of a pollutant, you have to get a permit from the EPA, or you're subject to the permit process. Well, 100 pounds of a volatile organic compound that contributes to ozone, that's a lot. But 100 pounds of CO2, which the Supreme Court said the EPA can regulate under that stupid decision a few years ago, well, that's McDonald's. Are we really going to ask every McDonald's, every Burger King in the country now to get a permit from the EPA? The EPA actually did an analysis of this and said, what did they say, Art? Do you remember this? They need to hire 200,000 regulators at the EPA to process the permits for all the facilities. It would be this building would have to get a permit. I'm sure this building emits, because of its use of natural gas and electricity, counts for 100 pounds of CO2. It's not very much. By the way, each one of us here, how much you emit of CO2 just breathing every year? It's about 800 pounds as an individual. So, 150 of us get together, we might need a permit. So the EPA, by the way, is trying to say, well, we're not going to do that. Good for them. They're going to set the threshold at 25,000 pounds, except that's not what the statute says. The statute says 100 pounds. And the first time an environmental group runs to court and says to a judge, the EPA is not enforcing the law, we want them to enforce permits down to 100 pounds, judge is going to look at it and say, yep, you're right, EPA, you got to enforce it on everybody. That's what the statute says. Environmental movement's all ready to do that. At some point, they're going to pick their time if this really goes forward. So there's a huge threat of this crazy greenhouse gas business going through. And the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, 2 weeks ago, punted on the issue. And once again said, we're not going to get in the middle of all this. We're not going to question EPA's findings on all this. So it's a huge question mark about this right now, how this is going to work if it really goes forward. So that's just one area. There's more to be said. So right behind you.
Two things about the EPA and then a question. Back in the 80s, somebody came over to Heritage that worked at EPA and said that the agency was hiring by quotas, which at the time I believe was illegal, and that was under the Reagan administration. Yeah. And the second thing is a person I knew that worked there was just out of law school a year or so, and he bragged to me how important his job was because he got to write the laws. Right. That the Congress typically will write a general thing, clean up the air, yep. And then the EPA goes and they writes every other thing, all the details, right. Myriad laws. So the question is, how much authority does a president really have over an agency? If Reagan couldn't prevent quotas, right. And if could a Romney and did a Bush ever succeed in having the EPA do away with some of these more stringent and costly rules?
That's a huge problem because these agencies tend to run on on automatic pilot. The last Bush administration tried to constrain the EPA in a few places, or try a different approach. They had their clean air interstate rule idea that never mind the details, and they kept getting swatted down in court because the environmental laws were written to give a hunting license to environmental groups to get what they want from judges. But this is not on the EPA specifically, but the second comment of yours is hugely important. And maybe I should have said something about it, and I'll use it this way because it's more fun. Congress does not pass laws anymore. They pass to-do lists and wish lists. And that's even true of Obamacare. So I actually thought when then Speaker Pelosi said you'll have to pass the act to find out what's in it, that was the most intelligent thing she ever said. Now, she didn't know it was, and she didn't mean it the way we mean it, but we have now found out. Well, this was perfect for a Twitter blurb, right? We now know what's in the law, a tax, right? Many taxes, right? But look, so Obamacare, we're up to 13,000 pages and counting of regulations, right? Regulation is a long word for law. That chap was telling you, I get to write the law. Congress doesn't write the law. It writes these broad statutes of aspiration, clean up the air, give us health care, and has language that says the administrator shall do X. The administrator shall figure out Y. The administrator shall determine what level is healthy, right? That's one of the big problems right now is the EPA gets to set its own targets, not Congress. So with a couple of exceptions. So this is a huge problem, and this gets back to, I did sort of make a bleak reference to this saying about delegation of authority to the bureaucracy. And that's a violation of the separation of powers in my mind, and that's one of the things we have to argue against across the board, not just on EPA, not just on Obamacare. It's happening with Dodd-Frank. It's happening in a lot of areas. And it's been going on for a long time. And finally people are starting to say, hey, more and more people are starting to say, not just us sort of cranky conservative scholars, more and more people are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, something's out of whack here. We got to rethink all this. So that's good. At least there's more of a fight afoot than there's been for a long time. Someone else? Yeah, lady here in front has a question. Well, let me get to a microphone because we're online though, so.
This will be our final question.
Okay.
My son works for an environmental firm called Tetra Tech. It's out of San Diego, but he's in the local office here. And of course, they work for contractors for EPA. He considers himself not in a crazy environment. He's a biochemist, so that's why he was hired. And he does work for permitting for water in California. But he's very frustrated by the working with EPA. And I think there's a lot of corruption going on in there. And so there's corruption in different regions, and he's concerned about it. So I just wanted your opinion.
Well, two thoughts to conclude. We saw that spectacular case, a month or two ago, of that Armendariz guy who got caught on tape saying, I like to abuse oil companies. This is really power corrupting, right? That's sort of an old-fashioned kind of corruption. I have no doubt that there's the kind of really even more insidious corruption where, if you're a company, I'll make a hypothetical. I don't know if this happens, but it's the kind of thing that does happen. And they find out, oh, you're a donor to the Heritage Foundation? Have you got your permit up to date? Things like that happen. Maybe not Heritage, but I think, you sign a petition, if you send a letter complaining to something. I shouldn't say too much. This is supposed to be deeply off the record, but I do know of a situation right now where someone who is making a public fuss gets a call from his government federal regulator. This is in the last 2 weeks. Call from his federal regulator the next day saying, why are you doing this? Well, that's not a friendly phone call, just a hi, how are you? Right? This is a huge problem. This is what our revolution was about, right? The other point, though, so your son works for an environmental consulting firm, frustrated by the EPA. In general, I guess I'll say in general, I sort of troll around a bit and try and pay attention to a couple of things like that. People out in the private sector and also a lot of academics who are scientists, and they're not especially ideological. They may be sort of conventionally liberal the way academics would be, but they're not especially hardcore ideological in an environmental way, and they're very frustrated and disillusioned with the environmental movement. They have no place else to go is the problem, and they're isolated. And it's hard to do. I've thought for a long time about, is there a way these folks could be organized into some kind of alternative? And I don't know if there is or not. It'd be hard to do, labor intensive, cost some money. And also, by the way, I can tell you, I've invited some, sort of distinguished environmental scientists from places like Duke's Nicholas School, which is one of the preeminent academic outfits, and they're a little nervous to come to AEI. See, so some of these people are sort of nervous. What's going to happen to them if they hang out with people like me? No, they really do worry about it. What's going to happen to their reputation? And, especially if they're not tenured. We're talking about academics. So I think there is Nixon used to call the silent majority. I don't know if it's quite that, but I think it may be something like that. There are actually a lot of sensible people, engineers out there, people who understand trade-offs inherently because they are trained in science and not in law, or environmental law and stuff like that, and who don't hang out with the environmental groups. The environmental organizations, I like to point out, are extremely rich. Right? I just take the NRDC. Its budget is bigger than the combined budget of AEI, Heritage, Cato, and the Hoover Institution put together. The total budgets for all four of those organizations, just one is bigger than all. So there's like 500 people in NRDC. They get their money from direct mail and guilty Hollywood liberals. And that makes them very insular, actually, and corrupt in both senses, intellectually, and I think actually in some cases, I think you can find that out. And so they don't have any idea how much they actually alienate a lot of people in the middle. But they have the megaphone, they have media sympathy, and so that's not going to change anytime soon, unfortunately. So it's a tough situation. Wish I could be a little more cheerful than that for the last answer, but I'll stop there and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. And for those of you who are interested in hearing more, you can follow the blogging. I don't know if Dr. Hayward tweets, but he does blog at Powerline. You can also see the response that he made to Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, a full-length response that goes in some detail to providing a rejoinder to the contentions in that. I'll invite you all now to lunch. Many of you have been here before and know that it's served downstairs. There are elevators as well as stairs directly below us here where you can get a box lunch. Even if you have to depart and get back to the office, we invite you to grab and go. The whole building is open for you too. It's a lovely day outside. If you'd like to eat outside on the 4th floor terrace or anywhere else, feel free to do so. I'll mention one event that's coming up. The month of August, we do not have this lecture series, but we'll resume again in September. You'll receive email notification of that. It will be on or around September 11th, and likely will focus on remembrance of that day and issues attendant to it. The next event that we do have scheduled, though, is War and Remembrance, the Story of the American Battle Monuments Commission. And this is from a very interesting perspective. One of the outstanding historians at Hillsdale College, and indeed recently named one of the 300 top professors in the country by Princeton Review, Tom Connor will be presenting this. It's part of an ongoing research project. He leads many Hillsdale student and other trips over to those battlefields, and I think you'll appreciate his perspective on this largely unknown, I think, to the American people story of just what this commission does and how important its work is in preserving our memorials to our fallen soldiers overseas. I'll close by mentioning, Steve talked about Twitter. We do tweet, and you can follow the Kirby Center online and also like us on Facebook. So with that, please enjoy lunch and the rest of your day.